All right, look, what we're about to do right now, I know it's gonna seem very wrong, but just trust me on this one. Everything's gonna be fine. Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 4 of my Build Together series. Today is all about GPUs. But before we dive into this, I do want to say real quick that I'm completely not tone deaf to the GPU shortage. In fact, it took me almost an entire year to gather these GPUs for these projects. Now, I have been told by Asus specifically that they are working hard to remedy the situation, but I also know that a lot of you are just waiting for an opportunity to buy one. And as they do become more available, my hope is that this video becomes a very helpful reference if you decide to waterblock your GPU. Now, in the last episode, we installed our motherboards into the cases. And because we're going to be water cooling those PCs, that means we have to do some delicate surgery on these GPUs in order to install the corresponding EK Waterblock. And I know the idea of taking apart a GPU can be extremely daunting. I mean, truthfully, the first one I took apart, I was terrified that I was gonna crack it and ultimately ruin it. But then afterwards, I realized this is nothing to be intimidated by. In fact, we are gonna take these 3 apart together, and hopefully by the end of this episode, you realize it's not as complicated as everyone makes it out to be. So let's get cracking. So a GPU is a graphics processing unit, and they were originally designed to accelerate rendering graphics. They're also able to simultaneously process a lot of data, which is important for tasks such as video editing and gaming applications. Now, there are 2 main brands of GPUs. You have Nvidia and AMD. These are all Nvidia. These 2 specifically are Founders Editions, which simply means the entire design is Nvidia's own works. Whereas this one, and the one that you saw in the intro, is the Asus ROG Strix model, which is considered a manufacturer card. Now, even Asus's own lineup has varieties as well. Take, for example, the Tough Gaming 3060 Ti that we installed in the last episode, which, by the way, that is a giveaway build, so you still have time to enter. Make sure you head to the link right here. It's also down below. Or, for example, you can get a non-ROG Asus card, like the 3060 Dual that we put in the Yule Beast, which is also a summer giveaway. So as I mentioned, we have our Founders Edition 3090 and our Asus ROG Strix 3090. Now, out of the box, they have a completely different aesthetic. So some of you might be wondering, well, why get one over the other? Well, from a size perspective, they're relatively similar. The Strix model, I guess you could say, is a little bit longer. They're pretty much the same width, but what makes the Strix card a little bit more unique is that it does come a bit more optimized, and it's been slightly overclocked. And overclocked essentially means that it's been tuned to give it a bit more performance. And that's really important, especially if you're new at PC DIY, because you're gonna want that great performance without having to kind of fiddle or tinker too much. Now, I'm not just saying this because I'm an Asus fangirl, but Asus ROG does have a really good rep for having great cards just out of the box, and they look so good. Come on. Now, the price point between the 2 of them are relatively in the same ballpark. I know things are a bit different because of the scalpers market, but you're kind of getting a better bang for your buck with the Strix card. Now, something that I want to point out are the ports that you would plug in this. This right here is your PCIe cable. This is what goes into the GPU and then attaches to your power supply. Now, we're not going to be talking about cables today. We're going to get to that in a later episode when we work on our power supplies, but there's a big difference between the Strix and the Founders Edition. As you can see on the Strix, it uses 3 8-pin connectors. Whereas on the Founders Edition, Nvidia doesn't use this typical design. Rather, it has a proprietary 12-pin connector. I just wanted to bring that to your attention in case you're planning out a build and you have your eyes on some snazzy looking cables, because I found that there are significantly less custom cable options when it comes to these 12-pin connectors. So again, we're not going to focus on cables today. We're going to get to that in a future episode. but just wanted to make you aware of that. Let's turn to our water blocks. So just like a CPU, GPUs, they also generate a lot of heat, so cooling is really important. Now when you get a GPU and you pull it out of the box, it already has an air cooler attached to it. And I can't iterate this enough. There is absolutely nothing wrong with installing your GPU as is out of the box. As long as you have good airflow and space, the air cooler on the GPU should yield great performance. So then you might ask, well, why even water cool? Well, it's because you want to eke out that little extra performance and, well, it looks really cool too. For example, when I built my battle station rig, if I had left the air-cooled GPU in the front, it would have taken up the entire width of the case. And with everything else I needed to add, there would be so much less space for air to move. And let's say I would have water blocked a Strix 3090 like this, it would have worked, but again, it would have taken up a huge section of the front and I wasn't quite going for that look. So that's why I decided to go with the Asus EK Waterblock's RTX 3090 because it already had the block on the card. I didn't have to install that, and it was a much smaller profile, which ultimately matched the aesthetic of my build. And that brings me to my second point of why you may water cool, and probably the most common one, the looks, because it does really look cool. Now for anyone out there that may feel a bit discouraged when it comes to water cooling, again, my hope is that you will have some sort of encouragement in watching me do this, especially as we progress further on into the series. Also, I have to say, nowadays, things are a lot more streamlined, instructions are a lot better, and it gives you a chance to kind of use your imagination and just go wild. So with that said, let's get to it. So this is a water block. This is EK's Quantum Vector Strix, which means it was made just for this Strix card. It actually works on both the 3080 and the 3090. Now the first thing I like to do is have a really clean space. Now if you are building, and let's say you don't have a ton of room, I actually recommend do this first before you start unboxing all your other components. I think it will make your life a little bit easier. The more room you have, I think the better you'll feel. The other thing I like to do is download the manual for your water block off of the EK website, and that is exactly what we're gonna follow. And then before I actually start to unscrew, I like to give my GPU a little bit of a pep talk. All right, look, what we're about to do right now, I know it's gonna seem very wrong, but just trust me on this one. Everything's gonna be fine. All right, here we go. Unscrew the baby screws. Pretty much everything that we're removing we're not gonna need. But let's say you were planning to put this back together, it's really important that you pay attention, know where each screw goes, and every screw is different. They even have different heads. So take pictures, take a video, watch this video back so you know where everything goes. When removing this part, you wanna do it gradually. You don't want to unscrew one entire screw at once, so you just keep going around. Now we're at the part that's arguably probably the most stressful, when you actually have to pull this thing apart. Now you want to do it gradually, you don't want to just aggressively rip at this because there's actually a few cables that we're going to have to disconnect. I like to keep the heavier part of the board on the table. There we go. You ready? Check this out. So there's a cable right here. And then there's a cable on the other side. So first we're going to just gently, there we go. And then we have to pull that off. So again, you're just being careful. This entire air cooler, we don't need. So we literally can just put this completely off to the side. I remember the first time I took apart a GPU, I was like, what? I have to get rid of this? Like this entire thing? I'm not using any of it? So yeah, this entire thing goes to the side. We're also going to remove the back plate and this. We only need the circuit board, the PCB, the primary circuit board. So that's what we're going after. If you start to pull and it feels tight, it's probably because there's just a screw. So just, you know, take a double check, and there you go. So we don't need this either. And we don't need this back plate. The reason why it's sticky is because of the thermal pads. There's not thermal paste on the actual back plate, but you just wanna be gentle, get a little bit of a grip. I find that if you turn it just a little bit, like this, it's not as scary because the board isn't flexing. And there we go. So this is the back plate. We don't need that. So this is the PCB. Now what we're gonna do is we're going to pull off the old thermal pads. That's pretty thick. I'm using a Noctua cleaning wipe to clean off the thermal paste. Boy, this cleaned off really easy. And then on this side, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna clean off the memory modules, kind of get all that gook off. Arguably, the most stressful part of water blocking a GPU is done. It's just pulling it apart. Once you've pulled it apart, everything else is literally just following instructions in terms of cutting thermal pads, putting on thermal paste, and slapping on the water block. So this is a thermal pad. This is exactly what we used when we put the water block on the extreme glacial board. I like to position the board in the exact orientation as the diagram. It just helps me see things a little bit more clearly. So we're basically just cutting rectangles and squares. It's really not that hard. I mean, it's no different than kindergarten if you think about it. So it's not stressful, guys. If anything, I think this is a bit relaxing in a way. I imagine if your hands are a little bit big, this can be a little bit cumbersome. But when it comes to peeling off the next layer, I definitely use tweezers to help. So you can get your tweezers out. All right, applying the thermal compound. Now it says to use an X. So why not? We'll use an X. I used a blob in the last one, but I'll use an X in this one. I have no problem with an X. Peel off the top of the thermal pads. There is another sticky side, so don't forget to peel that off. That would not be good if you left this plastic on. Of course, the last one always gives you trouble. Come on, sassy pants. Okay, there are these little nubs right here. I find that if you use that as a guide when putting this on, it works. All right, again, just make sure that everything is clean. You ready? 1, 2, 3. We're just gonna place it right down. It's on. And then we're going to flip it over. All right, and then basically we're gonna put a few screws in place. What I like to do is organize all of my screws into piles. All right, so since we're putting a back plate on here, we're not going to need to put a screw in all of the holes just yet. 4mm screws with the washers. Clear washer, similar to when we did our motherboard standoffs and we were screwing our board into place. We kind of did 3/4 of the way and then we went back around and tightened everything up. And now we have to pull up the manual for the back plate. So the first step that they want you to do to install the back plate is actually remove this terminal because we're going to be using an entirely different one that's attached to the back plate. So now this time around, we have a whole different set of thermal pads. And this you have to pay attention to a little bit more because there's different thicknesses. 1mm, 1.5mm, and 2mm, and another baggie of screws. All right, when I did this on the other one, I started following the directions of the 3080 because it's actually listed above it in the manual, so just make sure you're referencing the correct GPU version. Okay, 3090, actually the 3090 is easier. There's less weird intermixing of thermal pads. Okay. Now let's just start peeling away. All right, here we go. Are we ready? Back plate. Do not touch the back. And it's just gonna go on just like this. I just realized that screw has to go there. Oopsies. So the screws are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then on the back plate, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here we go. Just like that. Oh my gosh, look at all the fingerprints. So again, we're going to screw these in, but we're not going to screw them in all the way. We want to go around the board or else it's going to be really challenging. All right, so let's tighten these suckers up. The important thing is the board is not flexing in any way. We don't want the PCB to be weirdly bowed or flexing. You want it to be nice and flat. So then the last thing we need to do is to connect the terminal, but you have to make sure that those rubber rings stay in place. You cannot reinstall this without the rubber rings. And the same idea, you want to gradually screw each one back into place. So the Strix card is done. It looks absolutely beautiful. It weighs a ton. So this is the one that you saw in the intro. I think I could get a bicep workout lifting these things. So next up is the Founders Edition. So just like before, we want to start with a clean space and get nice and organized. Also, we're going to pull up the EK manual. Now on this Founders Edition, the screws are hidden under these trim pieces. On the right side, we pop this off, and look, there are 4 screws. We're going to take those out. Now on the other side, there are 4 screw covers, and the best way to pop these off are with tape. Boop, 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 boop. So these are the 8 spots that we have removed the screws. And now we can pop this off. Just wiggle it a little bit to loosen. And look, there it is, our PCB, which we need to remove entirely, but first we have to detach 3 cables. The Founders Edition has 3, whereas the Strix had 2. And these are more delicate too. And I have to be honest, off camera, I struggled with this yellow one, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. So now we can take off the silver I/O bracket, the input-output bracket, all 6 screws get removed. So back to our PCB, we have to remove these 4 screws, and we're doing it gradually. We want to loosen each one up, and that'll do it. There we go. Now we can actually remove the PCB from the air cooler. Just wiggle it. Look, we're free. It's as simple as that. Let's say goodbye to the air cooler. See you later. And let's start cleaning and cutting. I'm using the same Noctua cleaning wipe to wipe down the memory modules and the GPU heat spreader, that shiny square in the middle. Basically, any surface that we're applying thermal pads or thermal paste to, we want to make sure it's nice and clean. And we flip it over and clean this side too. Time for our thermal pads. They're all the same thickness, 1 millimeter, so we don't have to pay attention to that. We just have to cut and stick. Now that we've prepped the PCB, we can grab our water block, but first we have to remove the back plate and the I/O bracket before we can attach it. And using our tweezers, because it's so much easier, we're peeling the plastic off the thermal pads and then apply the thermal paste. Now I'm using an X pattern because that's what EK suggests, and I think it will be just fine. I also have tested it out before and pulled it off, and it looks totally covered. Full coverage, that's what we want. Now it's time for the water block. Pop that on. Boom, flip it over, and now we attach these 4 screws with a washer. The I/O goes back on, and now we get to prep this side before we can put the back plate on. Although, I'm gonna make one quick modification. You see how the back plate is black, but the front is silver? Well, I want it to all be one solid color. So I'm gonna switch the back plate with my other Founders Edition water block, so that way it all matches. So in the end, I'll have one fully black and one fully silver water block GPU, which is gonna go much better with my case design. So again, we're using the diagram to help us figure out exactly where we have to put our thermal pads. So again, we're looking at the diagram in the manual and placing our pads in all the right spots, directly on the PCB. And unlike the Strix, this is just the standard backplate that comes with the water block, whereas with the Strix, we installed an active backplate, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. And another thing different with this Founders Edition, we have to apply 3 dots of thermal paste right here on the shining triangle, and then we can put our backplate on. Screws go in, followed by this triangular piece, and we're done. Time to do one more. And there we have it, our 4 GPUs completely water blocked. I can't wait to install these into the cases, which we're gonna get to in a future episode. But I have to say, I know this video is a little bit longer, but I wanted to keep it more like a tutorial. So if you have a GPU or when you get your hands on one, you can reference this. And hopefully it gave you a bit of confidence regardless of your experience. Because it's not that bad, right? I mean, you can totally do it. And if you decide to use EK Waterblocks for your parts, I can attest that the manuals have come such a long way. First of all, the words are easy to understand and the illustrations are so clear. Plus, they give you a screw guide, so you can easily match your screws using this without having to flip back and forth between the manual. Such a simple idea, but goes a long way. Now, I'd say the hardest part for me this time around was disconnecting this yellow wire on the Founders Edition card. You saw that there were 3, the 2 flat ribbon ones, super easy. But this yellow one, you had to unlock the latch, which I did, but I could not get it to come out without ripping the entire latch off the board. Which doesn't affect my builds, but say I wanted to put it back together, I'd have to figure out a way to solder that back onto the PCB, which Steve over at Gamers Nexus confirmed that it controls the LED for here. So thanks, Steve. But again, nothing that we have to worry about for these builds. So as you can see, the Founders Edition has a much smaller profile than the Strix. So we're gonna be using one of these in our Lee & Lee 011 Dynamic Mini, and it's gonna fit really nice, similar to the pre-made 3090 that I put in my battle station that I mentioned earlier. Now, with the Founders Edition, we installed the backplate that came with the EK Waterblock kit, whereas with the Strix, we installed the active backplate. This one right here is the DRGB Plexi, whereas this one is your acetal. So as you can tell, we're gonna be able to see the liquid flowing, it's gonna light up, it's gonna be super cool, whereas this one is gonna give us that more kind of dark, stealthy look, which is gonna go great with our Threadripper build, which we're gonna do later on in the series. Now, the purpose of the active backplate is that it provides cooling to the VRM. Those are those memory modules that we saw on the back of the PCB. And it's particularly important with the 3090s because the VRMs are on both sides. Now, do you really need an active backplate for normal gaming? The quick answer is no, and Linus did a great video on this. But just like a water block, you pick it out because you're trying to eke out the most performance and for aesthetics. For example, if I were to mount this Strix card horizontally, I'd lose out on seeing all the RGB and liquid. Whereas this one, this has it on both sides. So this would be vertically, you'd see everything, or this would be horizontally. Again, you'd see it there too. So this Strix card is gonna get mounted vertically in our Fantex case. Whereas this fully blacked Founders Edition card is gonna go in our Inwin 303. Now ideally, I'd mount it vertically so we could appreciate the RGB and the liquid, but given the size and dimensions of that case, that's gonna require me to give up a bottom radiator and fans, and I'm not quite sure I wanna do that. So that means we may have to install it horizontally, but I'm gonna try to think out of the box and come up with a solution. So next week we will be diving even deeper with this, along with starting cooling part 1, which is going to be all things radiators and fans. I'm even going to attempt to paint my first radiator, which I'm very excited about. In the meantime, don't forget that the Tough Gaming giveaway is still live. So go to this link right here. I think you have a little less than 2 weeks left to enter. And for more PC DIY building tips, head to the Asus PC DIY page right here. It's also down below. Thanks again for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you soon. Bye.